When advocates of the minimum wage speak of this policy, they describe it as one rooted in empathy, charity, and justice. It is said that its conception came about as a consequence of social injustice, and that it arose as a measure to prevent exploitation of people. Today, those who support this public policy claim to be friends and protectors of the underprivileged. But what if I were to tell you that the minimum wage did not arise solely on the basis of these very kind things that are attributed to it, but that in part the minimum wage was born on the basis of racist and even eugenics movements, that the minimum wage came about not only to maintain workers' wages, but to actually prevent black or Chinese workers from earning a living, or that in more extreme cases it came about in order to exclude the most marginalized people in society. Or even worse, that even today it disproportionately and negatively affects young black men. Well, if I were to say all of this, you would probably dismiss this as nonsense, but unfortunately this is far from being an invention. In this video, I'm going to present you with all the evidence that shows that in part the minimum wage came about because of racist thoughts, and that today the black youth is affected by it. To talk about how the minimum wage was a policy heavily influenced by racist movements, we must first talk about a certain type of economists of the last century, known as the progressives. Progressives were economists prevalent between 1890 and 1920, characterized by their support for movements that would supposedly anti-corruption and social inequalities caused by the wars of capitalism. Hard taxes, increased labor regulations, including the minimum wage, and increased regulations for industries were things they constantly advocated, so the policies of this period and some of the later ones will be strongly influenced or even directly supported by this group of economists. The problem is that some of these economists base their policies, such as those of the minimum wage, not only on causing greater prosperity, which is, and of itself, is debatable, but that's another issue, but also base their support for this measure on a complete and utter racism toward black people, Hispanics, Asians, and a complete rejection of people with different mental abilities. To see what I mean, let me turn to the academic paper by Thomas E. Leonard, an economist specialized in the history of America, who is from Princeton University. Leonard's paper is titled Eugenics and Economics in the Progressive Era. Here, we are told that this group of economists was fully aware of the effects of unemployment caused by minimum wage policies, but that while modern economists see this as something negative, they saw it as something completely desirable. They even saw it as a social benefit, since their unemployment helped them to perform eugenics, this by expelling from the workforce those workers they consider unemployable. We must remember that eugenics is a movement that seeks to improve the human race, this through active intervention and manipulation of human reproduction. Eugenics supposedly seeks to improve the race through displacement, sterilization, and even extermination of those people who are not considered to have good genes. Literally, and without exaggeration, the same thing Hitler did. So this group of economists sought to drive out those they did not consider good enough for society. For these economists, there were two channels under which the minimum wage supported the eugenic operation. First, a minimum wage discouraged migration, since migrants generally compete against the local population for lower wages. A minimum wage will mean that migrants will have no reason to migrate, since they will be prevented from earning a lower wage and thus will not be hired. The other way is the aforementioned, where the minimum wage will remove those deemed unemployable, who once identified could be segregated to rural communities or even sterilized. This all sounds pretty heavy, so it will be completely justified to ask what is this based on. Well, it is based on the writings of Henry Reuter Seeger, who apart from being a progressive economist, was also the president of the American Association of Economics in 1922, and 3 times president of the American Association for Labor Legislation, meaning that he was a big shot in the world of economics and labor, not at all a weirdo that nobody paid attention to. Reuters argued that those who benefited from a wage need protection from the grueling competition of the casual laborer, anti-Trump, as well as others he called unemployable, who unfairly undercut the wage of more deserving workers. He said that the minimum wage protected deserving workers from competition from the underserving, making it illegal to work for less. This in itself is bad enough. He acknowledged that one of the reasons he supports the minimum wage is that it prevents those he considers unemployable from working and thus earning a living. Unfortunately, this is not even the worst thing he said, for the absolute worst thing he dared to say was the following: if we are to maintain a race that is made of capable, efficient, and independent individuals and family groups, we must courageously cut off the lines of inheritance that have proved undesirable by isolation or sterilization. In other words, for these economists, it was not enough to displace those he considered unemployable, but it was also necessary to ensure that they could not reproduce. Oof, this definitely reminds me of a certain little German man with a mustache, and that is definitely not a good thing. Unfortunately, it doesn't just stop there. Other people, like the Harvard economist Arthur Holcomb, who was one of the members of the Massachusetts Minimum Wage Commission, also shared these racist ideas. For example, he apparently referred to the attempt minimum wage law in Australia because it protected the standard of living of white Australians from the odious competition of the colored races, particularly the Chinese. The last example I will give is John R. Commons, who in his book Race and Immigrants, this University of Wisconsin economist and social reformer argued that competition in wages not only lower wages, but also select out the unfit races. He argued that competition has no respect for superior races. The race with the lowest necessities displays others. In short, these economists argued that blacks, Asians, and others need less subsistence, and therefore could subsist on less money, and therefore threaten the superior race. Each of these arguments is horrible, unscientific, and immoral. Furthermore, based on these examples, we can see how several progressive economists argued in favor of the minimum wage, not only as a measure to maintain the quality of life, but also as something that allow to expel from the labor market those they consider undesirable for society, blacks, Chinese, and even Hispanics. These economists recognize that these people in condition of free hiring could find employment, which was bad according to their perspective. For this very reason, they used the minimum wage as a tool to exclude and marginalize from society those people they felt should be outside of it. They wanted a minimum wage to take away these people's ability to support themselves. That said, it should be remembered that while it's true that this position was not shared by all so-called progressive economists, it was advocated by a president of the American Association of Economics, that being Henry Royce Seeger, that was also one of the founders and three-time president of the American Association for Labor Legislation, and even to a lesser extent by one of the most important social reformers of the last century, that being Florence Kelley. Having clarified this, I would like to say that to conclude based on these opinions that the minimum wage has racist roots will be insufficient, since these examples may have been an isolated and spontaneous movement that was not repeated in the history of the minimum wage. Therefore, to develop my argument further, let me refer you to the Davis-Bacon Act of 1931 in order to demonstrate that racism in the conception of the minimum wage was not an anecdote, but something completely embedded in this public policy. Just a clarification before starting to explaining this. During the following minutes, I will use several quotes from different politicians that refer to the labor situation of that time. These quotes are almost 100 years old, therefore the racism present at that time will be reflected in their words. I personally took the decision to change some of the cruder words for their potential to be offensive. In turn, I did not change others because I consider it's also important to listen to the context and expressions under which this debate arose. For those people who like to see directly what the quotes say, meaning the much cruder language, in that case, the studies and resources used will be in their original form in the description of the video. That said, we continue. In 1927, Algernon Blair, a contractor from Alabama, received a federal contract to build a veterans hospital on Long Island, New York. Blair used primarily black Southern laborers to construct the building. This was obviously on the basis that these workers accept a lower wage than white workers in New York. As a consequence, Robert Bacon, who was the representative from Long Island, complained to the House of Representatives that these workers were being paid a very low wage, which meant that the working conditions in that part of New York where the hospital was being built were being altered. In turn, Congressman William Bishop of Georgia replied that this was a real problem that happened in any community with an overabundance of black labor. To make a long story short, what happened was that in a great variety of states in the country, such as Washington, Oregon, Oklahoma, or Florida, to mention a few, there was a constant and systematic complaint on the part of politicians representing the construction unions. The similarity in each of these complaints is that the politicians complained about how black workers were displacing local white workers. For example, Congressman John G. Cochran of Missouri mentioned that he had received multiple complaints in recent months about certain contractors employing black mechanics. Congressman Clayton Allgood reported that cheap labor by people of color was in competition with white labor across the country. So in short, the politicians who, it must be remembered, represent the interests of the mostly white labor unions, argued that it was unfair that local people should have to compete for labor with black people who were paid less money. As a consequence, in 1931, the Davis-Bacon Act was born, requiring that all construction receiving federal funds had to pay a wage that was at least equivalent to the local prevailing wage, which in practical terms meant paying the union wage. The problem is that in 1931, there was a clear and systematic racist behavior, therefore black workers could not join unions. So in practical terms, what the Davis-Bacon Act actually did was to expel black workers from the labor market, who went from receiving a slightly below average wage to receive a wage of zero. Unfortunately, the discriminatory effects of this law did not remain in the past. For example, in 1964, the Labor Department of the Nixon administration recognized that repealing this act would have positive effects in increasing minority labor in federal public work jobs. Unfortunately, Nixon offended his union voters and this action was never realized. Even more recently, in 2005, in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, President Bush temporarily suspended the David Beacon Act in places affected by the hurricane to facilitate cleanup and rebuilding. Pro-union critics indicated a complete and utter anger and argued that the act was necessary to keep immigrant workers out of Katrina-related projects. Under political pressure, Bush eventually repealed the suspension. But the discrimination and job displacement caused by the minimum wage did not stop there. For example, economist Walter Williams points out how the Brotherhood of Locomotive Firemen, unable to prevent railroad companies from hiring black non-union workers, called for regulations. How do you think that those regulations materialized? Well, in a minimum wage. In fact, there is record of a union worker at the time celebrating the new rules because, in his own words, they removed the incentive to hire black people. Another anecdote dates to 1967 when the minimum wage was extended to farmers as a consequence of the so-called war on poverty, which by the way was a resounding failure, even worse than Vietnam. In this case, black farmers who were accustomed to a wage of $3.5 a day were now legally obligated to receive $1 per hour, which is a hell of a lot more. As a result, in the Mississippi Delta region alone, more than 25,000 black workers became unemployed. This had such devastating effects that the black migration caused by minimum wage was referred to in 1968 by the New York Times as the Black Exodus. Having said all of this, I think that it's quite clear that the policies proposed for eugenic and racist purposes by economists at the beginning of the 20th century did not remain mere ideas. The minimum wage systematically displaced and deprived the black population, just as they had envisioned. Moreover, even if most of those who pushed for the minimum wage did not share the racism of the progressive economists, the results were absolutely the same. Black people were left without jobs, without wages, and without subsistence. Having said all of this, some will surely be left wondering and said, well, even if there was racism in the conception of the minimum wage, and even if the minimum wage disproportionately affected the black population, that doesn't mean that the same thing is still happening in the present. Well, that's a good point. So now I'm going to show you why the minimum wage does disproportionately affect this population even today. During the era of segregation, Jim Crow, the Ku Klux Klan, and a complete and overflowing racism in America, the unemployment rate among white and black teenagers was about the same. Today, using pre-pandemic data, the unemployment rate for black youth, meaning those between the ages of 16 and 19, is 23%, which is twice of that of their white counterparts, and almost 9 times of the Asian teens. This means that for every 4 black youth looking for a job, 1 of them cannot find one. How is it possible that even when there was a complete and systematic racism toward blacks, when they were excluded and discriminated against in almost every aspect of life, how is it possible that even then they had the same unemployment rate as white youth? But today, 100 years later, and objectively, after race relations are infinitely better than they were then, how is it possible that unemployment rates among blacks and whites are so different today? Well, the answer is the minimum wage. The minimum wage is the cause of this large difference, and what causes so many young blacks to find themselves unemployed. This can be confirmed by looking at periods when there was no minimum wage in real terms. For example, in 1948, a period in which companies were experiencing the consequence of World War II, the minimum wage that had been imposed by the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 had been repealed in real terms by inflation. This means that legally there was a minimum wage, but because there was so much inflation, everyone was earning much more than that, so no one paid any attention to the existing minimum wage. As a result, unemployment for blacks 16 and 17 years old was 9.4%, for the white peers it was 10.2%, and for blacks 18 and 19 years old it was 10.5%, while for white 18 and 19 years old it was 9.4%. As we can see, the difference between black and white youth in employment was minimal. In fact, there was more employment for blacks 16 and 17 years old than for the white counterparts. But what happened next? Well, after that, there was a new increase in the minimum wage, which deeply affected young blacks. We can underline this with more data, which was collected by the economist Milton Friedman. This data tells us that before 1956, unemployment of young blacks between 14 and 19 was hovering between 8 and 11%, which was about the same as the young whites. 2 years after the legal minimum wage was raised from 17 cents to $1 an hour in 1956, the black unemployment rose to 24%, while that of white youth only rose to 14%. From all of the above, we can conclude that one of the main causes of the great unemployment problem affecting black youth is the consequence of a relatively high minimum wage, which deprives them of the opportunity to improve their economic situation. I think it's pretty clear right now that the minimum wage does affect black people disproportionately, and not just 100 years ago, but it does today. And it doesn't just affect young people, it hurts adults as well. But why is this? Well, this question is completely accurate, so let's answer it. What happened is that 100 years ago there was a brutal discrimination towards the black people in America. Also, the liberation of the slaves had been in 1865, which was relatively recent. Therefore, the black population, having been enslaved, didn't have the opportunity to access training or education that would make them more valuable to employers. So when a black person went and asked for a job, he was faced with two limitations. The first was possible racism on the part of the employer, and the second was that he was probably not as skilled as his white competition. Under this situation, the only logical response was to ask for a lower salary. As a consequence of this, even if the employer was extremely racist, he had a great incentive to hire him, since if he did not do so, the person would offer his job to another competitor, and therefore, the one who rejected the black person would have a loss. So the free market punished those who had racist hiring practices, which only greatly benefited the black population that otherwise would not be employed. But when the minimum wage appeared, no employers had no incentive to hire them. Worse yet, the minimum wage benefited the racist employers, as it allowed them to continue to engage in the racism at no cost. There is a very important lesson here. While the free market punishes racism, state action incentivizes it. In more recent times, there are still educational and business gaps between black and white population in the United States. The reasons for this are debatable, but for practical purposes, it has the same consequence. When a minimum wage is implemented, black people who are the least productive are the most affected by unemployment. Here, I want to emphasize that when I refer to them as having lower productivity, I don't mean it as something that is racially based, but rather that the circumstance in which most black Americans have grown up, school, family, health, etc., have allowed them to accumulate less human capital than their white counterparts. As a consequence, they are the most affected by the minimum wage increases. In fact, I share the opinion of economist Milton Friedman, who said that the most anti-black law on the book in this country was the minimum wage, because of the devastating effects it had on black communities. In closing, I want to stress that it's true that there are many black people who are in poverty, but the minimum wage is not the cure, because while it may help certain black people, overall it's an absolute and complete disease that only makes things worse for many others. Educational choice, eliminating certain zoning laws, changing the system of perverse subsidies that incentivize self-destructive behavior, ending the war on drugs, decreasing licensing laws, and so on are much more effective ways to support black people. I also want to tell you that part of this video were based on the excellent book Discrimination and Disparities by Thomas Sowell. Anyone who is interested in understanding why certain groups of people, whether racial, religious, or cultural groups, are destitute while others prosper, will find this book very helpful. The link is in the description. I'm Rodolfo Ferreira, don't forget to subscribe and like this video. So, I said goodbye.